Good morning, everybody, and welcome. I am Abigail Gilman from the Department of World Languages and Literatures here at Boston University, and I'm so happy to see you here this morning. We are here today to honor and remember our teacher, our colleague, our mentor, Professor Elie Wiesel, and we are going to honor him by learning. We're going to be learning together this morning. We have three panels that are going to follow one after the other with short breaks between. And we have invited 13 extraordinary people to speak to us today about how they have learned from Elie Wiesel and how Professor Wiesel's work and teaching has shaped their own writing, their own thinking, their own practice. This is a dream team of speakers and teachers. I could listen to any one of them for an hour, but we don't have that this morning. This is the beginning of what we hope will be future conversations, future events, and future dialogues among all of us. So I will turn this over to our moderator, Ingrid Anderson.
Thank you so much for coming. It's really a pleasure and an honor. And I know that Professor Wiesel would be delighted to know that we're all here on a Sunday morning to learn together. I'm going to just introduce everyone very briefly. There's a full bio paragraph on each of our speakers in the program, so please have a look there if you're interested in more. But just so we have enough time to really talk, we will stick to just names and brief mention of what they plan to discuss today. So our first speaker here will be Stephen Bigelow, who is a teacher at Millis High School. He has used Wiesel's text Night in his classroom for over 15 years and has seen firsthand the lasting effect of Wiesel's words. And I figure for a panel on using Night in the classroom, Steve is a wonderful place to start. So let's welcome Steve. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. I just want to begin by saying I am sincerely and truly humbled to be a part of this day. As I looked through the panelists throughout the day, I was just overwhelmed with some of the contributions they've made to society. And I was saying earlier, to be perfectly honest, I feel a little bit insecure as just a high school English teacher here as a part of the day. I never met Professor Wiesel, but his work, his teachings, and his beliefs have had a dramatic effect on my life. And I also think, the fact that I am here sort of speaks to the reach of his message, that it sort of validates the personal experience of his message. So very quickly, what I wanted to talk about today, I'm going to talk about sort of once I was invited to be a part of the panel, what kind of came through my mind, my connections to the man, to his work, specifically the book Night. Some of the work I've done with the book in my classroom. I'm going to share with you some of the writing my students have done. I then want to read to you an excerpt from the book Night. It is my single most favorite page from any book. It's a short excerpt. I think many of you may know it. It's beautiful, it's tragic, it's graceful. And I then want to end by sharing some thoughts that former students of mine sent to me that they wanted to have shared today about the impact that Professor Wiesel and his work has had on them. So just to begin, it was over the summer when Reggie reached out to me actually and asked about maybe participating in the day. And I was overwhelmed then, as I'm overwhelmed now. Of course I wanted to be a part of the day, and so I started thinking about what I would want to say today. And over time I sort of started focusing on the fact that, and the realization that Elie Wiesel was a true personal hero of mine, and I had never met the man. My only interaction had been through YouTube videos, speeches, text, and I felt a little bit silly that as a grown adult, I hadn't really put much thought into who my personal hero was. And the more I thought about it and the more I sort of internalized and came up with a definition of what a hero is to me, it all came back to this man. And I shared it with my wife, and she validated that. And at the beginning of this school year, I always teach night first because the students love it. Quick story, literally on the first day of school this year, I had a girl walk in the classroom, takes one step in the room, and she's like, "Mr. Bigelow, are we reading night this year?" And I was like, "Yep." She's like, "Yes." So the kids love it. So it's a good way for me to start the year because they think I'm the man right off the bat. So I set the bar high. But right off the bat, I had that same discussion with my students because it was on my mind. I said, let's talk about what it means to be a hero. And what we did is we had open discussion, really, really honest discussion. I had the students write out their own definitions of what it means to be a hero, and I'm going to share some of those with you right now, because I think for those of us who have met this great man, or who have not even met this great man, when you hear these definitions, I think they'll all circle back to what he stands for. So some of the responses I got from my students this year, this is just about a month ago, these are 17 and 18-year-old kids. They say to me, "A hero is someone who overcomes adversity to be successful, and I define success as living a life of happiness, love, and morality. A hero is a person who does amazing things, treats people with respect and dignity, and always does what is right, regardless of the situation. A true hero is selfless and puts the needs of others before themselves. A person who sees the world through innocent eyes and believes in learning from every life experience. Anyone can be a hero, but what makes a real hero is a person who lives a genuine life with true sincerity. Someone who doesn't judge, doesn't seek power, and doesn't hold grudges. A person who is willing to laugh, cry, and experience their emotions in the truest form. When a person can do these things, to me, they are a hero." So I thought that was wonderful. And then we took the lesson a little further, and I said, all right, let's get to the essence of really what it means to be a hero. I want you to take your sentence, and I want you to whittle it down to that one word that you think is the essence of heroism to you. And so we did that, and we came up with a great list of words, and I have some of them here that I'll share with you. And again, I think they completely circle back to the man that we're celebrating today. And so some of these words included adversity, morality, dignity, respect, learning, empathy, selflessness, genuine, sincerity, beautiful, honesty, love, and innocence. And for me, my word was compassion. That was what my word circled back to. And I have 2 children, and actually my wife and I have talked about the quality that we want to instill in our kids more than anything else is compassion. And that is my greatest takeaway from teaching and reading this book. I don't think it's possible to read this book and not come away from it a more compassionate person. And so now I want to take you to my favorite excerpt in the book. I'm going to go teacher on you right here. Quick showing of hands. How many people have read this book? No judgment if you haven't. Okay, wow, awesome, sweet. Great. So I'm not even going to introduce the passage then, because I have a feeling most of you will know it. Who knows? Maybe it's been done in classrooms before. Maybe it's been overdone. I don't know. But regardless, to me, this is the single best, most important page of literature I've ever read. And I think it's because it's so round in what you can take from it. It's everything that this book stands for. It's horrific, it's tragic, it's beautiful, and it's graceful. And it's a book at the end of it's a page from the end of the book, and it reads, "Father, are you there?" I asked as soon as I was able to utter a word. I knew that he could not be far from me. "Yes," a voice replied from far away, as if from another world. "I'm trying to sleep." He was trying to sleep. Could one sleep here? Wasn't it dangerous to lower one's guard, even for a moment, when death could strike at any time? Those were my thoughts when I heard the sound of a violin in a dark barrack where the dead were piled on top of the living. Who was this madman who played the violin here, at the edge of his own grave? Or was it a hallucination? It had to be Juliac. He was playing a fragment of a Beethoven concerto. Never before had I heard such a beautiful sound in such silence. How had he succeeded in disengaging himself, to slip out from under my body without my feeling it? The darkness enveloped us. All I could hear was the violin, and it was as if Juliac's soul had become his bow. He was playing his life. His whole being was gliding over the strings, his unfulfilled hopes, his charred past, his extinguished future. He played that which he would never play again. I shall never forget Juliac. How could I forget this concert given before an audience of the dead and dying? Even today, when I hear the particular piece by Beethoven, my eyes close and out of the darkness emerges the pale and melancholy face of my Polish comrade, bidding farewell to an audience of dying men. I don't know how long he played. I was overcome by sleep. When I awoke at daybreak, I saw Juliet facing me, hunched over, dead. Next to him lay his violin, trampled, an eerily poignant little corpse. So to me, that's as good as it gets in a book, because it just, I've read that passage, hundreds of times, and it still strikes a chord with me. And to my students as well. I've taught students from probably over 50 different countries, speaking 25 different languages, and I've had students with very, very troubled, tough backgrounds crying at this text. It just brings out raw emotion, and I think, like I said, you can't read it and not become a more compassionate person. So the last thing I want to do is I want to share a few thoughts from some of my former students. I did reach out through social media. I'm not a huge social media guy, but this is an example where I think it really benefited me. I reached out to any of my former students saying, I'm going to be a part of this day. We're celebrating this man. I know you were in my class. If you have any thoughts that you want me to share about the man, our class, what we did, how it has affected you, please do. And I got a lot of comments, probably over a dozen comments. A lot of them were, I didn't know that he had passed. That's very sad. He was a wonderful man. I loved that book. It was the favorite book I ever read. But I got a couple that were really poignant and stood out, and so I'm going to read those to you now. The first reads, I came to the United States after a massive earthquake destroyed my home in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. I lost everything. I saw terrible sights, heard terrible sounds, and I witnessed unforgettable things. Until I read Night, I felt there was nobody in the world who could understand what I had lived through. This was the first book that ever moved me. After reading Night, I came to realize that we all as people live with struggles, internally and externally, and that each person's own experiences and suffering is legitimate and valid. It doesn't offer us entitlement or privilege. Wiesel wrote, and we studied, suffering is something personal and discreet. I know it will never leave me, and I don't want it to leave me. It would be a betrayal. How can I leave that pain? All I can do is try to make something out of that pain, to find a meaning to it and share that meaning. I plan to finish college, return to my country in hopes of making it a better place. The earthquake in 2010 made me who I am today, but reading Elie Wiesel's book shaped my opinion of the world, and it is a beautiful place. Another passage I got, one more I'll share with you, reads, reading Night forever changed me. I had never read a book that was both so terribly sad and so wonderfully beautiful at the same time. When in class we read the scene where Elie's father dies, I cried, I wept. But I think that was the single most important moment in my life, because it was in that moment that I realized the power that we hold as individuals to affect one another. Human decency is the most basic and vital element to humanity. We can never lose sight of this. It was in this moment that I found my moral compass, and to this day, I live my life by it. And just as a little side note, one of the other things I do with the book is throughout it, we do an exercise and we create our moral compass. We have a compass, and at each direction is sort of the moral values that the students live their life by. And so again, it just speaks to the absolute connection that these students make with this book. And I'll end by sort of fast forwarding my school year 8 months to the last day of school this next year, which will be wonderful. And for probably the last 10 or 15 years, I spend the last day of my class really I kind of watch the clock, and for the last 5 minutes, I give my students the same lecture every class, every year. And I talk about how I think my role as a teacher is to educate the students. And obviously what I mean by that is it's important to learn the fundamentals of writing and critical analysis and discourse and debate. But to me, the true purpose is for me to serve as sort of a moral mentor. And I hope that throughout the years that I've been a teacher, that I've done this for my students, and I express to them, well, it's important to do well in school and get good grades. You want to go to a good college. You want to get a good job. You want to get that great car. You want to have a lot of money. What really matters in life is being a good person and good citizenship and being a part of a world where you can make positive change. And I reference back to one of my favorite speeches that Professor Wiesel gave, and it was at the Dartmouth commencement from 2006. And I always end my lecture to my students the same way he ended that lecture there, and it's the last thing I'll say now. And I tell my students, and then hopefully if I have time to write, the bell rings and they're out the door. He says, whether you know it or not, in some parts of the planet, there are people who need you, and they're waiting for you. And I just think that that message is one that we need more than ever in today's society. And again, I'm honored to be here today, and this is a man who's had a dramatic impact on my life, and clearly, as you've seen, my students as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Wow, I'm speechless. You brought me to tears, and I know if Professor Wiesel were here, he'd probably have some tears in his eyes right now, too. Next is Reggie Jean, who's sitting right next to Stephen there. He is the director of Boston University Upward Bound, and he recently received a grant from Boston University's Jewish Cultural Endowment, yay, to hold a one-day conference for Boston public school students centered on Night, the Holocaust, and cultural sensitivity. So please welcome.
Great, thanks, Ingrid.
Yes.
And thanks for your remarks, Stephen. Did a great job. And again, my name is Reggie Jean. So yeah, I direct the Upward Bound program here at Boston University. So I want to thank for the invite to be here. Upward Bound is a program that works with students who are either low-income families or first-generation college potential to go to and be successful in college. So thanks for allowing me to be in this space. I'm humbled by the opportunity to be here. When I spoke to Abigail about this day, and this was in April, or this was in the spring, actually before April. And just the opportunity to be here just sort of resonated with me. And so, like Stephen, it was, I was very excited about this opportunity. So thank you for holding this day. I think it's a special day for a special person. I'm here to share my perspective on Night and Elie Wiesel from basically the student perspective. I don't look like it. I don't look like a high school student, but and I'm not. It's a mystery. But that's when I first came across the book Night, and so I want to talk about that, how my experience was, and then how sort of fast forward to today. As a student, in high school, so I went to a school in New York, in Brooklyn. And as growing up, there wasn't a lot of books that I gravitated to. I can name 4 or 5 that I really liked. So in elementary school, it was Judy Blume's Tales of Fourth Grade Nothing and Super Fudge. Those are, And then I didn't really come across, it was not until high school that I came across another book that I liked, The Learning Tree by Gordon Parks. So that resonated with me. It's a good coming of age book. So that resonated with me. And then it was Hiroshima by John Hersey in high school. And then Night. And then, reading Night really, took me to places that, as a high school student in New York, so I'll paint the picture. So I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, in the Flatbush area, and it's a pretty homogeneous area where I grew up. African American, Latino Americans, poverty, drugs were rampant. It was the late '80s, so crack sort of took over a lot of the area. But my high school, Sheepshead Bay High School, was very diverse, and so it was. So I learned a lot from the people around in that high school. But the thing about Night is, it sort of takes you. It sort of suspends your reality while you're reading the book. Like you're not in your own space. You're sort of in the book, and that was sort of that was an incredible thing to do in a book for me. Your surroundings sort of go away while you're reading the book. So literature sort of helps open windows to other people's lives and other people's viewpoints. But great literature, it really can transform you. It changes who you are. And that's what happened to me. The more I read the book, the more you wanted to read, and I was sort of entranced into it. And that's from the beginning of the text throughout. By the time I was in the middle of the book, that's the thing too. In high school, I was a slow reader, right? I like to tell people, oh, it's because I'm meticulous. I like to really get into the book, but I was a slow reader. But with Night, it just flows. The prose are powerful, and they just flow. And the language is very accessible. It's a universal book. Yeah. Anyone can really grasp it. So by the middle of the book, I was actually listening to classical music. This kid from Brooklyn. I hope the volume wasn't too loud, or neighbors might hear me. I had a reputation, but I would put on classical music and my headphones, and that's when we use tapes, to listen to music, right? And it really took me. So when I got to that passage, actually, that Stephen read, I probably wasn't listening to Beethoven, but I was listening to classical music, and it just even sort of further, had an impact. It really impacts your soul. So the lessons that I got from the book is one is a deeper understanding of the Holocaust, of genocide, in a way that it's hard to, in my history class, we talked about genocide and the Holocaust. But when you read it in the text, in Night, it's different, it's personal, and it really has an impact on you. You learn about human nature through the different people who you come across in Elie Wiesel's life, concentration camp, and the people that you learn about human nature and what happens to human nature when people are challenged. And then you also learn about the power of one. You learn about the power that, the bad side of it is, what a tyrant can do, what one person can do. But you also learn about what individuals can do who are good and how that impacts things too. So I've been in education my entire adult life. As a teacher, and I didn't have the pleasure of teaching Night. I taught middle school social studies, but when there's certain topics when you teach that it's not the most fun topics for the kids. SAT prep. Multiplication tables, it's not the most fun thing. So as an educator, you have to get your bag of tricks out, and you gotta, dazzle and present things in a certain way, and do activities and do hands-on projects. I have two twin girls now who are 5, and sometimes when they have to take their medicine, you gotta spruce it up, The thing with Night is that you don't have to do that. It sort of lends itself to discussion and deep thinking and just activities that sort of flow from the book naturally. So it really is a unique tense. So Miss Linewan, that was my 10th grade teacher who gave me, I'll never forget her name, Miss Linewan. I forget a lot of my teachers' name, but that name I'll never forget because she's the one who introduced this book to me. She didn't have to do a lot. The text just spoke for itself. With Night, it's really is an educator's dream to be able to use it. Another lesson from Night is the importance of telling your story, bearing witness. And so the students that I work with, I always talk to them about, your goal is to go to college, be successful, but always tell your story, because you don't know who you'll impact with your story. There might be younger students who learn about you or hear about you and say, I know about adversity, right? If that person can do it, I can do it. And that's the powerful lesson with Night. It's not only a textbook way of writing a memoir and telling your story, but it shows you the impact of telling your story. an impact that, we have a room full of people here who have felt that impact. So telling your story, because you don't know anyone, you don't know if somebody else will benefit from hearing your struggles. When I came to Boston University as an undergrad, I had the pleasure of hearing Elie Wiesel. I was a core curriculum student in the College of Liberal Arts, now CAS, but I always call it College of Liberal Arts. So the core curriculum had, guest speakers, and I remember hearing Professor Wiesel talk about the Book of Job. And that's pretty powerful, and it's still, I still think about that. And then later on in the fall lecture series that Wiesel would give, did anybody come to those, the fall lecture series? It was incredible, right? No one could pack a room like Elie Wiesel. No one. It was in George Sherman Union, and at that time, it was really the biggest space on campus, and that place was packed, right? Still to this day, no one could pack. Ken Elmore comes close to packing it. But really, he and again, it's because through the book, through his personal narrative, through the impact he had on a one-on-one level with people, few people had that impact, or have that impact even today. So this spring, through funding from the Jewish Cultural Endowment, supported by Elie Wiesel Center for Jewish Studies, I'm gonna, they gave funding, and I'm gonna organize a symposium for high school students, for students in Boston who read book, at their high schools, and we're gonna come for a day to look into the book, learn about the Holocaust, learn about Elie Wiesel, and learn about cultural sensitivity. So it's something that, coming to today and looking forward to that event, it's really an opportunity for me to, again, engage in this dialogue about Knight, about this incredible human being. Just like I look forward to today, I'm looking forward to that day as well, and extending the word of Knight and Elie Wiesel. So thank you.
Thank you, Reggie. That sounds like a terrific program. Those students will be very lucky, and any of us who get to listen in on all of it will be lucky too. Thank you.
You guys will be getting an invite.
Yay! I'll be there with bells on. Okay, next is Dr. Nehemiah Polen, who is a professor of Jewish thought at Boston's Hebrew College. Not exactly what he plans to speak about today, but I can guess. I'll let him start. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Ingrid. Thank you very, very much. Thank you to you and Abby and all the organizers. I'd like to begin by picking up on some themes that Stephen and Reggie have already put on the table so beautifully and powerfully. Is this loud enough? Can you all hear me? Can the person at the back make me louder?
There we go.
So, Stephen, you highlighted that extraordinary passage, which I think is not overquoted, and I appreciate you're focusing on it. The one about music, the one about the violin, and playing with depth and with nobility and with grace and with all the infinite riches and vibration and repercussive power that music brings in that circumstance is just so extraordinary, and it brings me forward to the classroom, because when we think about teaching Knight in the classroom, I'm thinking of his classroom. I was a student here, as some of us were. We had the privilege of having him as our teacher. I was here as a student, actually 77 through 82, and I was his teaching fellow, I think from 79 through 82. So I want to bring some classroom memories into the picture. And Reggie, you talked about sharing stories. And we all know that the most powerful aspect of Professor Wiesel's message is the power of storytelling. He was so many things. He was the most extraordinary storyteller. Stories from his own life and stories from the lives of the Hasidic masters, and just stories from the cultural heritage of the world as a whole. And you said, tell your story, even if it's a story of pain and anguish, because you never know when somebody else may need to hear that message. You're going to be helping other people. And that's true, but I'd like to take it just a step further. When we share each other's stories, one of the messages that I heard, I think we all heard in the classroom, is that our lives are incomplete until someone else returns to us from their experience a piece of our story. So my life will never be complete or even comprehended by me until I hear the missing pieces that I hear from Steve and Reggie and everyone else here, and it's totally reciprocal.
Yeah.
So that highlights to me part of the magic and the power of the classroom, whether it was the overflowing crowd at the auditorium at the Monday night lectures, or on the 6th floor of the School of Theology building, where people were literally hanging out the windows. I hope nobody's here from the Office of Security and Maintenance.
No one fell.
No one fell. No. No one fell. No one fell. So there was Professor Wiesel's title was, I mean, not that he ever mentioned it, but he was Andrew W. Mellon Professor in the Humanities. I hope I got that right, because I'm going to make a point about that. And people would sometimes say he was Professor of the Humanities. No, 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 no. He was Professor in the Humanities, which is to say, this was not a disciplinary assignment which he analyzed from the outside. He was situated within the humanities. And it strikes me that's a way to think about the contrasts and the paradoxes, but ultimately the resolution of his extraordinary life. Because so much was formed in that kingdom of night, in that kingdom of death, in that kingdom of humiliation, in the kingdom of horror, where all belief was apparently crushed. And it was, as we sometimes say, man's inhumanity to man. Right? We all have heard that phrase, and I think many of us say, it's true, but it's way too general. Each crisis is a very particular crisis. But we often hear that phrase, man's inhumanity to man. Well, he took the inhumanity and he became the professor in the humanities. And he was situated within it. And he created a culture of compassion within the classroom. I don't think I've ever seen a teacher, or maybe anyone, so deeply attentive to the words of students. he would sit there listening, and I remember he would always have a fountain pen, not a ballpoint, but a fountain pen. And students would talk, and he would take brief notes, and he would sometimes aggregate. That is to say, I think it was because he didn't want to correct or negate or reprimand, but he would lift up comments. If they were wise, that's great. If they needed redirection, he didn't want to do it directly. So he would wait until a few comments were on the table, and then he would so skillfully and artfully just raise and lift and respect and show that there were sparks of light and truth in every single comment that was said. So tremendous dignity and respect, and putting together everyone's narrative and everyone's story. Now, I came in, some of you know this, I was a pretty insular kid. I was just telling Reggie that I grew up in Dorchester in this little Jewish enclave and went to a private Jewish school, a parochial school. Then I went off to a rabbinical college where I studied Talmud literally 12 hours a day. And then I come to BU. It's the first time that I was in a classroom that I met Catholic religious. It was the first time that I met a devotee from the Hindu tradition. The first time that I went to an ashram was following Professor Wiesel as he went to pay homage to the teacher and the guru of one of his students. So it was the opposite of insularity. And I reflect upon the fact that when somebody is going through, God forbid, torture, and that's what that period was, it was torture, the ambit decreases. You focus on your own horror and pain. And nothing else exists except for that pain. And ironically, your own body becomes the enemy. Because the pain is coming from your body. The pain is not even coming from the perpetrator, it's coming from your body. And it's so easy to understand why people are completely broken because they hate themselves. And here was the man who had gone through that and whose circumference of compassion and concern and reverence and dignity and understanding had only expanded to include the world without negating or without forgetting his own very, very particular origins. So that's what I'm picking up from what you're saying, and that's the memories that I have. So that's part of what night means for me. It's both the depth of experience, but also the extraordinary breadth that is somehow opened up.
Nehemiah, my friend, I could listen to you all day.
2 days.
2 days. I could listen to you for 10 days.
Thank you.
Nehemiah. What I want to say before we move on to Irene is that I think you really touched on something that Wiesel talked a lot about as a teacher, which is the best thing that you can do as a teacher is to model what you want your students to do. Don't say, watch me do this, and you do. Just do, right? Thank you so much. Thank you. Okay, Irene Resenly. Thank you so much for being with us. She is a doctoral candidate in curriculum and instruction at University of Wisconsin, and she is speaking about teaching night in her Holocaust course at University of Wisconsin-Madison. Thank you for being with us.
I have to start with a confession. This is quite a surreal moment for me. So I graduated from Boston University in 2005. I took Professor Wiesel's class in the fall of 2004. And out of that experience, my life changed. So I came to BU studying German with Professor Gilman and foreign language education. I was supposed to be a high school German teacher, and I blame Professor Wiesel completely for the fact that I've never been a high school German teacher. because I had the extraordinary privilege of my first job when I graduated from college being working for Professor Wiesel in his office here at BU alongside of Rachel Strauss. It was the greatest honor of my life to be in it, and it quite frankly changed the trajectory of my life in ways that I'm still discovering and making sense of 12 years later. Yes, 12 years. For those 12 years, a lot about my life has shifted, but one way I've always identified the professional work I do is that of a Holocaust educator. It started in his office, and it's continued at my time at UW-Madison as an instructor of the Holocaust course there. So UW-Madison, like BU, is a gigantic school. It's one of the Big Ten schools, and the Holocaust class is a course consistently offered every year. And as a doc student, I got the privilege to take it on early in my career. And I've had the privilege to teach the course 5 times. And in my teaching of the course, every time I've taught night. And that has been one of the changes I brought to how the course looked. So just to give you a little bit of background on the class. So the class is Holocaust History and Representation. So the first half of the course is a chronology of Holocaust history. The second half of the course, we talk about different issues in representation. I've had anywhere between 25 and 35 students, so a wonderfully small group. So we get to have lots of discussion. And I would say part of my pedagogical approach is always getting at learning with deep questioning, and questioning with the goal of sense-making. Night always falls in the first class on representation. So it's our way of talking about Holocaust memory. So I should talk about my students. Those 25 to 35 students I have come from all majors in the university. So because it's could fulfill a requirement for the university, I get students who are studying everything from forestry in the Midwest to history, Jewish studies, business. I've had so many nursing students in my course. It's been truly incredible, the diversity of perspectives and interests in how people come to learn about the history of the Holocaust. And more so, even the personal backgrounds of my students. People have such different points of access and understanding to this history. And I find that such an asset in my classroom to get to have people with such diverse perspectives and interests, and I value that. And it's my goal as an instructor to make sure the questions we ask in our classroom, that everyone has something to offer, that everyone has deep insights and meaning to make there. And so the way I position night, I think, is a bit unique than other people might encounter in university courses. So the class is entitled Holocaust Memory in America. And for that class, I asked my students to either choose to read The Diary of a Young Girl or choose to read Night. And I frame it as saying, I want you to read the book that you've read before. So either in your middle school experience or high school experience, choose the book you've read. In all the times I've taught the course, so about 125-ish students, I maybe had 4 students who have never read either. The students who select Night, it's usually about half to 2/3 of the group. And I have them purposely revisit the book for a reason. I want them to experience this text as an adult. And in experiencing it as an adult, reflect back on their experience as a teenager of what it was like, and sort of imagine where they were then when they were reading and how they were making sense of it with their great high school teachers, and where they are now, particularly in our class that's so geared towards critical inquiry and self-reflection, and what that means for them. So I want to just take you through some of the questions that I ask in that course. So the way I situate the text in the class is this. The first half of the class, for about an hour, I give a mini lecture on the history of Holocaust memory in America. And then after that, I contextualize The Diary of a Young Girl and Night in its historical context. So talking about issues of representation, what it meant when the books first came out, to give my students some context. And then I set up the assignment like this. I ask the students to take out a note card and just write a text or a quote or a piece of the text that resonated with them. It isn't hard for them to find one. That usually takes a minute or 2. Then they turn to the person next to them and they share the passage. I have them read it out loud and then speak through why it resonated with them. So that might seem like a very simple start to a very complex text, but it's really important for me that my students start with them first and what grabs them first, and start to unpack what that means. And for my students, it means very different things for every person. And then for an hour and a half, we have small group discussions with people who have also reread Night as well. And the questions I give my students are just an offering. I make sure to give questions sort of in 4 different categories, and these are the categories in which I think about the questions. So questions of content, questions relating night to the reader, frequently asked questions, and questions of representation. So some of the questions my students might engage with in terms of questions of content. So if night were a person's only contact with the history of the Holocaust, what would he or she have learned? In questions relating night to the reader, I might just ask, when is the first time you read Night? For what purpose? What are your memories surrounding it? And now, what is it like rereading Night in this class? Do you approach or interact with it differently? Why or why not? If so, in what ways? The frequently asked questions, an example of that is, so the following are some of the most frequently asked questions that Wiesel received about Night. Have you lost your faith in God? Did you marry the French woman? And then I asked my students to say, what do you think these questions mean about how others are interacting with this text? And then for questions of representation, I say, in the preface of the latest edition, very formal, Wiesel speaks to the popularity of the text. Why does he think it became so popular? And what are your thoughts on it? So in all of these questions, really my goal are for my students to engage very broadly with questions that speak to a what, so the content or the history that's being represented in his book, questions of relevance, the so what questions, and really being open to relevance and resonance meaning different things for different people, and seeing that as an incredible power of the text. And then my favorite question, so what does this say about you? So what you're drawn to, what you're thinking, how does this help you understand your own positionality as a learner of this history, as someone curious or invested in learning more about this man through his work? So I have to say this discussion is an hour and a half, and for those of you who teach in university settings, you know it could often be challenging to have students talk for an hour and a half on their own, and I could tell you my hardest job in that class is to get the students to stop talking. We always run out of time. And I want to sort of share why as my closing thoughts. So first, I think it's about building on what they know and can understand through this text, and what they know and can understand from their memories of interacting with it. Professor Wiesel gave us the tremendous gift of making his pain public, and that's extraordinary. And for many of my students, and I would argue for so many people in the US too, his story is our understanding of this history. And to have such an amazing point of reference as an educator is a tremendous gift too. Because when we could have that shared understanding, a shared understanding of his story, as a teacher we could get at such great depth of learning and exploration, having that common ground. And what I also think this resonates with my students is, from my perspective, there's no pre-prescribed outcome. I don't ask them to write a paper on it. There's no assessment at the end of class in any particular way. It's them taking ownership of the meaning and the sense making, and I think the Night allows for that in ways that are extraordinary. So I could probably talk to you all afternoon about my students too. I think they're brilliant and amazing. So find me during the day and let me talk your ear off. But for now, I'll just say thank you.
Thank you, Irene. I can tell that you spent some time in the classroom with Professor Wiesel. And so last but not least is Dr. Alan Rosen, who studied in Professor Wiesel's BU classroom for 10 years. He is a doctor of Holocaust literature and testimony, and he lectures on these topics at Yad Vashem's International School of Holocaust Studies and other Holocaust study centers. He's with us from Jerusalem today, so welcome, Alan. So nice to have you.
So Professor Wiesel was once asked in one of the 100,000 interviews that he generously gave what his favorite Hasidic teaching was. He said, there are many. He said, but if I had to say one, said, was the teaching from Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk that says, man is the language of God. Mm-hmm. Man meaning human being is the language of God. So we're hearing very much about Professor Wiesel's extraordinary gift with language, and we see that it comes out of this connection to an appreciation for human being embodying forth God's language. We're speaking about night, but in truth, we're speaking also about Professor Wiesel's classroom that Rabbi Nehemiah and I had an opportunity, and many of the others here had an opportunity to participate in through the good graces of Martha Hauptman, who's sitting here in the front row, truly was the one who made it possible. And that Professor Wiesel's writing of night and teaching of so many books really then is a line to appreciate his consummate gift with language that brought forth in the reading list that you should all have, yes, of his books that was to be passed out, of almost 60 books. And this can be found, if you don't have it, at the website of the Elie Wiesel Foundation. And if I can draw your attention to the fact, at the very bottom of the page, there's a book entitled Celebration Talmudique, the celebration of the Talmud. Professor Wiesel titled of his 50 plus books, 5 of them celebration. Celebration was the driving force behind his writing and teaching. And his classroom was like this book, this litany of the word celebration was a celebration. So in the few minutes that we have, I wanted to just refer to a couple of ways that celebration took place. But I also, given the force of our comments on night, very briefly want to offer two other quick comments. In the classroom, that what distinguished it were 5 different things that I write about in an essay that came in the book that Stephen Katz and I edited, including Professor Wiesel being transparent with his convictions. When he taught something, when he taught Rabbi Nachman's Tales, he would say, I love Rabbi Nachman. And in a university setting, to be so transparent, to bring forth that kind of emotional conviction was just so revolutionary. Also, as Rabbi Nehemiah mentioned, the force of his listening. And that was in the very structure of the class, where the class would start off always with 2 students doing a presentation. And I, as a teaching assistant, had to feel the complaints of other students. We took this class to listen to Professor Wiesel, and he sits there listening to us. But that was itself an extraordinary model of the way of being able to respect what a student would bring. Also adding to that, his simplicity. If most university professors and most of us who earn a doctorate in university try to make our language more sophisticated, more complex, he always tried to make his language simple. And another extraordinary level of model that he would bring to students who are trying to forge their way into a university, trying to find a way to tell their own story. And he would show them that the simplest is the best. Also, the classroom became a place of prayer. So one way that showed itself was Professor Wiesel during the 1980s was meeting with very extraordinary people all over the world, including Gorbachev, the prime minister, premier of Russia. He was going on a trip, and at the end of the class, he asked the students for advice, what he should say to Gorbachev. And he listened, each and every one. But he then also, there was a student, Margaret Smith was her name, who then asked Professor Wiesel, Professor Wiesel, can you tell us when you're flying? When are you making this trip? He was taken a little bit aback just by the directness of this and why. So he said, I'm happy to share with you, but why do you want to know? So she said, so we can pray for you, Professor Wiesel. Let's circle for 1 minute back to Night. And Night against this extraordinary list of books that he wrote. We know that the version of Night that we use now was published in 2006 in a new translation by his wife, Marion Wiesel. And at the time that was information, Professor Wiesel, who I had the privilege not only of being in his classroom, but to speak to him or meet with him once a month for 25 years. And we conferred about this publication. So he asked me, what do you think? Should I keep the preface that Mauriac wrote, or should I take it out? Why? Because at the time that it was first published, Mauriac was a Nobel Prize winner. He had the prestige to carry Professor Wiesel's book to a huge public. In 2006, Mauriac was virtually unknown, and Professor Wiesel was at the pinnacle of fame. So the preface, which is problematic in a number of ways, Professor Wiesel has written about, was, do I keep it? So when I asked him, so what do you think? He said, I have to because of loyalty, because of what Francois Mauriac did for me. It would be wrong to take that out. And that itself is such a huge lesson. We also conferred on publishing his first version of Night, the one in Yiddish, Und die Welt hat geschwiegen, which Professor Wiesel did not want to publish because he felt that the French version was crucial and definitive, but at the same time, that it was important to say that his first book was written in Yiddish, in the language of Eastern European Jewry, his first language, his Mama Lashon, and that itself was a lesson. And that book is now being translated in its full version into German, and eventually we hope will be translated in full into English. And finally, just finally, it's not the easiest place to end.
Giving him the look.
Yeah, oh,
Time.
it's kind of the
Yes.
elbow, yes.
The elbow is now.
The figurative term.
Yes.
So I met with Professor Wiesel on June 18th, 2015 at the Foundation in New York. We would talk all the time about teaching Night and teaching Night with other books and what he thought about that. So he said to me, it's wrong to teach Night on its own. Mm-hmm. I said, wrong? He said, wrong. He said, if I had thought that Night was the only book of mine that would be read, I wouldn't have published it.
Yes. Yes.
So as we have this list there of books, that our task, it seems to me, is to be able to open the door to the celebration that Professor Wiesel brought forth in the wake of Night and brought into the classroom and brought to the world. Thank you.
Thank you. We've ran over time. I apologize to our friends and colleagues who follow us. We're going to let them take their seats now. Please find us later for talking. We will be happy to talk and chat your ears off, as you can see. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you for having us. Thank you to our panelists.